Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Electricity Focus webinar, part of the World Energy Outlook 2018 series. We are waiting for a few more colleagues to join the webinars. We're seeing a lot actually joining now. Please stay with us. We are going to start in just a couple of minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the World Energy Outlook 2018 webinar series. Today, we are going to focus on electricity. That's been the fuel in-depth analysis of this year World Energy Outlook. This is the third webinar of a series of 4. In the first one, we explored the main overall finding of the World Energy Outlook. Friday last week, we explored the main fuels result, and next Monday we'll have a special webinar on the results of the Sustainable Development Scenario. So this year, 2018, has been named at the IEA the Year of Electricity, and for the first time the World Energy Outlook has devoted nearly 200 pages to this vector, to this fuel. We have had over 40 contributors throughout the IEA working into this special focus. And if you haven't had the opportunity to buy the book yet, you will actually have the opportunity for the first time to explore our main findings in our new website that has a full page that takes you through the main findings of the electricity focus. To make our analysis ever more accessible to colleagues around the world, we will be complementing this webinar, the website, and the book itself with a number of commentaries. They will be starting putting out as of this week, going in depth into several different aspects that we've covered this year. So a number of new ways for you to explore our findings, for us to be ever more transparent. So why did we decide to have the World Energy Outlook focusing on electricity? The reasons are several and all pointing to a key direction. The 21st century is the century of electricity. First of all, electricity demand has been growing twice as fast as global energy demand. This has happened over the past couple of years, but we are expecting this to continue to happen in our projections going forward. So a signal that understanding electricity demand trends is becoming ever more important and ever more challenging, as it rests in a very significant way on government policies, as Stephanie Bouquet, who has been leading the work on electricity demand, will explain us in a second. Our economies are becoming increasingly reliant on electricity. All of you are actually connected to us via not only internet, but without electricity or some kind of battery, you wouldn't be able to enjoy our new connected world. So electricity security is becoming really more central in our daily lives. We take it very much for granted, but what we are analyzing is actually how do we ensure that our economies, while becoming ever more connected, are also able to rely on electricity 24/7. Another important point is investments. I've seen of the several colleagues that are following us are actually working in companies, and what we are tracking, we're tracking investments every year. We found out that for the past couple of years, for the first time ever, investments in the power sector were larger than oil and gas. There is increasing interest in, of course, utilities that have had electricity as their core business for many, many years, but increasingly other companies are turning into electricity as a new area of business opportunity. Having said all this, the electricity sector is a sector that is a century-year-old, very well-established business models. However, what's been happening over the past decade is a tremendous transformation that has been enabled really by solar PV and wind, variable renewables, where their costs have been coming down very significantly, mainly thanks to a very significant policy push that we have seen throughout the world. But this is very much transforming how the electricity sector is working, business model, market design, with tremendous ramification. And Brent Warner, who has been co-leading this work, will take us through the main findings of this major transformation that is affecting the power sector and the energy sector at large. So these are basically the rationale why we did go into a lot of detail on electricity this year. However, there is another important point that I would like to bring to your attention when we look at recent data. We have been putting together data for the first 10 months of 2018. In March, we will come out with our new update of the global energy and CO2 emissions. But while preparing this, we have already found out that 2018 is very firmly on a rising trend for CO2 emissions, putting CO2 emissions and concentration at the record high level ever. This is worrying because this is happening at the same time while we are seeing record installation of solar. So while we are having a very good sign of renewables coming more and more into the energy system, we need to go deeper into understanding how do we turn the trend of CO2 emissions and put our energy sector in a way that is compatible with our long-term climate targets. Another news always related to electricity is a good one. You may know that you've been tracking electricity access since the year 2000, so for nearly 2 decades. Back in the year 2000, we were counting 1.7 billion people without having access to electricity. This year, we are very pleased to announce that we have passed the bar of 1 billion. We are now below 1 billion people not having access to electricity. This is thanks to 2 major pushes. One, actually in India, that has announced full electrification of villages in April 2019, a major news that is bringing India as being the lead success story in electrification in global history, having electrified more than 500 million people in 7 years, basically the entire Europe in 7 years, a tremendous success story. On the other hand, we are seeing several countries, Sub-Saharan Africa, Kenya being in the lead, pushing very, very strongly electrification and turning for the first time the ever-increasing trend of people without access in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, those of you that follow the World Energy Act know that we are not doing forecasts, we are doing projections, which means that we take our readers through several scenarios. The first one we call the new policy scenario, and actually paints a picture of where we would be going over the next 2 decades if government policies don't change compared to the ones that they have currently implemented and the ones that they are discussing. We also have another main scenario, which we call the sustainable development scenario, which has a very different nature than the new policy scenario. It actually describes a normative future in which we ask ourselves what type of energy sector and energy transformation we should be seeing over the next 2 decades if we were to meet sustainable development goals. What are those sustainable development goals? First of all, what would it mean, what would it take for the energy sector to meet the Paris Agreement? So our global climate change goals. Second, what would it take if we were to meet sustainable energy for all, so access to electricity and clean cooking by 2030, and at the same time actually improving air quality in cities, which are currently polluted by the use of combustible fuels and lead to several million premature deaths a year. So the Sustainable Development Scenario is a benchmark that describes what would be needed to the energy sector to comply with all those goals. We will go in depth into this scenario next Monday, while today we will take you mainly through the new policy scenario, the new scenario that we have actually developed for this edition of the Outlook, being focused on electricity. We call it the Future is Electric scenario. What is this scenario about? This scenario actually answers a different question in this Outlook. When we are doing the projections on demand, indeed electricity demand, the pace of electricity demand is one of the key uncertainties. And Stephanie in a second will explain you why. She will take you to some of the surprises. But while on one hand there are uncertainties about the pace of electricity demand, we know that those uncertainties are mainly in one direction, which is up. Actually, electricity demand could grow higher than we are expecting in our new policy scenario, and the reasons are basically 2 or 3. The first one is that digitalization could grow even faster and further than we are expecting in our main case. It's not only about energy, it's really about how our societies are evolving. It could be more connected, and these could have implications on how much electricity we are using in our daily lives. On the other hand, policymakers may be wanting to push electrification of transport and heating more quickly, so we have decided that we wanted to explore a scenario which is plausible and is the higher case for electricity. Now, without any further ado, I'll pass the floor to Stephanie. She will take us to the main findings on electricity demand, and then Brent Warner mostly on electricity supply. Stephanie.
Thanks, Laura. So electricity is indeed more and more the fuel of choice to meet needs of households and companies. So on this figure, we can see that since 2000, global electricity demand has increased dramatically. It has increased by 3% a year, and it accounts now for almost a fifth of total final consumption, compared to just over 15% in 2000. That means that now electricity is the second largest fuel in end-use sectors. But on this figure, we can see that the growth in developing economies is quite different from the more or less stagnant demand in advanced economies. In fact, in 2000, the United States was the world's largest electricity market, but since then, there was a five-fold increase of China in electricity demand, and today, 1 out of every 4 terawatt-hour is consumed in China. So that means that now United States is the second largest market. But even though electricity demand has expanded dramatically in developing economies, as Laura mentioned, there are still nearly 1 billion people without access to electricity. In the new policy scenario, electricity continues to expand. Electricity demand increases by 60% in this scenario, and as Laura mentioned, grows at twice the rate of overall energy demand. But similarly to the last 15 years, developing economies continue to dominate this growth. These countries and economies account for nearly 90% of the growth, and China and India together account already for half of this growth. Demand in advanced economies rises modestly from today to 2040, due mostly to policies for further electrification of heat and mobility. But by 2040, developing economies account for 2/3 of electricity demand compared to 1/3 in 2000. By 2040, it means that China electricity demand is more than twice than that of the United States, and India is not a too distant third compared to the United States. We have just seen that on this graph that electricity demand in advanced economy has flattened. The question is, what has led to that kind of trend? In fact, electricity demand has fallen in 18 out of 30 IEA member countries since 2010. There are several factors to explain this, but the main reason is energy efficiency. We have new sources of electricity demand, such as digitalization, as Laura mentioned, or electrification of heat and mobility. But in fact, these sources have increased electricity demand only by 350 terawatt-hours between 2000 and today. For example, electric cars represent around 1% of all passenger vehicle sales, which is low, of course, in advanced economies. And another example is regarding electrification of heat in buildings. Since 2000, around 7% of households have switched from fossil fuels to electricity. So mostly from gas to electric radiators, for example. And in industry, less than 5% of heat demand is met by electricity. And all these sources of growth have been more than outpaced by energy efficiency savings. Changes in economic structure have also led to a lower demand growth, but energy efficiency is really the key reason. In the absence of energy efficiency improvements, electricity demand would have grown at 1.6% per year compared to the 0.3% that we have observed. So that's quite a big difference. Since 2000, energy efficiency measures have helped to save or to avoid 1,800 terawatt-hours, which is almost a fifth of the current electricity demand in advanced economies. Over 40% of these savings were done in the industry sector, mostly thanks to minimum energy performance standards for electric motors, and all the rest was done in the building sectors thanks to MEPs as well for appliances, cooling systems. Another key area is lighting, where we have seen that energy demand has already peaked for lighting thanks to the greater use of more efficient light bulbs such as LEDs. So we can see that energy efficiency has already shaped the current electricity demand in advanced economy. The question is, what will be its role in the future? So if we look at today, the electricity demand is mostly done in industry and the building sector. In the transport sector, the electricity demand is quite negligible compared to the others. In fact, the 3 million electric cars that are on the road today contribute only to 0.1% of global electricity demand, which is really low. By 2040, the building sector remains the main driver of global electricity demand in the new policy scenario. There are various reasons for that. First, for example, around 30% of households today owns an air conditioner. This number will grow dramatically by 2040. Only 13% of households use electricity for heating. This will grow as well. And as we mentioned previously, there are still 1 billion people without access to electricity. Another key factor, as Laura mentioned, is digitalization, and electricity needs for ICT are really on the rise today, are expected to continue to expand in the future. However, we can see on this figure that the outlook for electricity demand growth in advanced economies is much more sluggish compared to developing economies, given the lower growth of population, but also of the number of appliances and air conditioners. The second contributing sector is industry. It remains also an important driver of electricity demand growth, and mostly located in developing economies. For example, China's industrial motors are the single largest sources to global electricity demand growth by 2040. They account for almost a fifth of the total global electricity demand. But the fastest growing sector is transport. Although it starts from a very low basis, and today 70% of the electricity demand in the transport sector is used for rail, but most of the growth will come from road transport, from electric vehicles. And compared to industry and building, the growth is more evenly split between advanced and developing economies. Developing economies will account for 60% of the growth within this sector. Policy commitments to support the electrification of vehicles is really a key contributing factor for growth in this sector. The stock of electric cars grows by a factor of 100 from now to 2040, reaching around 300 million electric cars on the road by 2040. But cars are not the only road vehicle mode that electrifies. By 2040, 2 3-wheelers and buses also see a major electrification. But as I said, energy efficiency will also play an important role in the future. And as in the past, energy efficiency acts as a brake on increasing demand for all the end-use sectors, and mostly buildings and industry. The growth of electricity demand could have been 60% higher without energy efficiency improvements. This means these energy efficiency improvements are due to more stringent MEPs, for example, in the building sector for appliances, air conditioners, but also more stringent MEPs in the industry sector for electric motors. The efficiency of motors in industry will really play a critical role in determining electricity needs for the future in this industry sector. So we have seen that policy play a role in shaping future electricity demand. As we have seen, energy efficiency can potentially reduce demand, but electrification of heat and mobility can increase demand. As mentioned by Laura, in this year World Energy Outlook, we have also assessed a new scenario, the future is electric scenario, to examine key areas of uncertainty. One being digitalization, the other one universal access to electricity, and the last one electrification of heat and mobility. First, in buildings, the key uncertainty is linked to the provision of electricity access, but also to the uptake of appliances for those that do not have access today to electricity. So in the future is electric scenario, we have assessed that there is universal access to electricity achieved by 2030, and that households who gain access have also a more rapid access to electric appliances such as fans, fridges, and then air conditioners. Another key uncertainty that we have explored is, as Laura mentioned, digitalization. So in this scenario, we have assessed the electricity demand implication of a faster uptake of network-enabled digital appliances. This creates, of course, higher demand within within our homes for appliances, but also from data centers to store this data and also to make the connection between all the appliances. Finally, in buildings, the last component that we have looked at is the electrification of heat. In buildings, a lot of end users use only electricity or rely mostly on electricity, such as lighting, appliances, and cooling. But all the heat demands rely mostly today on fossil fuel. And the question is, how far can we electrify heating? Because today technologies exist to fully electrify the sector, but in many regions they are not competitive compared to fossil fuel technologies. So in the futurist electric scenario, we have assessed the economic potential for electric heating, and we have assumed that policies succeed also in removing non-economic barriers. For example, the split incentives in the building sectors, but also helping to deal with the high upfront cost of some electric technologies. In the industry sector, another sector that has a lot of heating needs, we have assumed that there will be a higher uptake of heat pumps for lower temperature heat in the futurist electric scenario. We have also looked at hydrogen. We have assessed that there will be a switch from natural gas to decarbonized energy to generate hydrogen feedstock for ammonia production. And we have also assessed an increased use of electric arc furnaces for steelmaking. As for buildings, for this sector, we have looked at the economic potential for electricity demand based only on the economic potential. We didn't include technologies that are still at the stage of R&D, or we didn't include technologies that are not yet ready for a further scale-up, such as induction or microwave heat or mechanical vapor recompression. Finally, transport. The question is, after many decades of oil within the sector, to what extent can electricity supplant oil? Already today, there are a lot of technologies available on the road to electrify this sector, but in many cases, the uptake of these technologies have been supported by policies. So in the futurist electric scenario, as with industry and buildings, we have assumed that policies succeed in eliminating non-economic barriers to allow a higher uptake of electric vehicles within the scenario. In the futurist electric scenario, so electric vehicles make big inroads in all road transport modes. By 2040, nearly half of the cars on the road, so nearly half of the total fleet of over 2 billion, are electric. There are also millions of light commercial vehicles by 2040 and 15 million electric heavy-duty vehicles, so trucks and buses. Another key component is 2 3-wheelers, as about 70% of 2 3-wheelers are electric by 2040 in this scenario. We didn't include electrification of aviation and shipping, as like for industry, these technologies are still on the stage of R&D. Of course, this major transition to electricity has big impacts across the energy system. First, electricity demand grows at a much faster rate than in the new policy scenario. Electricity demand is about 7,000 terawatt-hours higher by 2040 than in the new policy scenario. And the share of electricity within total final consumption is also higher, reaching almost a third. Given its importance already in the new policy scenario, and given the 3 uncertainties area that we have explored in this scenario, the building sector accounts for the major share of electricity demand growth in this scenario, 40%. Transport accounts for around 1/3 of electricity demand growth in the futurist electricity scenario compared to the new policy scenario, and the remainder comes from industry. But the switch to electricity has also major implications on other fuels and on the energy system as a whole. If we look at oil, for example, by 2040, oil demand for transport is at the same level of today, despite a near doubling of the global car fleet. Electrification of heat in homes and in industry reduces oil demand as well. So that means that oil demand peaks by 2030 and then declines to recover more or less its level of today by 2040. But electrification provides also an avenue to reduce both CO2 and air pollutant emissions at the point of use. And it can bring also significant benefits in terms of health. In the future electric scenario, we have around 2 million fewer premature deaths compared to the new policy scenario by 2040. But that doesn't mean that we fully decarbonize the energy system. The carbon emission in this scenario continue to increase, even though the future electric scenario has a higher growth of renewable energy in the power sector. That means that electrification alone is not sufficient to meet climate targets, and that this requires a more comprehensive energy system strategy, both on the demand and on the supply side. And talking about the supply side, I will now give the floor to Brent Warner, who will give you more insights on that side.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. So turning to electricity supply, I'd just like to give a little bit of an overview on what happens in terms of capacity, but also the generation mix looking forward out to 2040. And I'll focus mainly on the new policy scenario for that. And then I'd like to touch on 3 key topics that emerge from those projections, focusing on flexibility, market design, and the overall competitiveness across technologies. So if we look at first installed capacity by technology, we have here the historical evolution from the year 2000 to date, and then to 2040. Fossil fuels have long been the foundation of electricity supply. And looking forward, coal and gas remain 2 of the largest sources of electricity. For coal, there's 180 gigawatts currently under construction today, and another 550 gigawatts planned over the next decade or so. Those are mainly being developed in developing economies in Asia. Mainly we're talking about China, India, Southeast Asia. And this growth will largely be offset, though, by retirements in advanced economies. Those are both due to policy, where you have the phase-out policies, and particularly in many European Union countries. And we're also talking about the retirement of an aging fleet that's often over 40 years old, particularly on average in the United States, for example. Gas-fired capacity actually overtakes coal in the coming decade, favored for its flexibility and its relatively low construction costs and short construction periods. So I've added here as well oil, which is steadily increases, actually. And this is actually part of a broader look from oil and gas producing economies as they look to diversify their economies and their fuel mixes. This was covered in more depth in our recent special report on producer economies. Next, if we look at the 2 largest sources of low carbon generation today, those being hydropower and nuclear power, we see that they're tending to increase as well. Hydropower continues to grow. This is largely China and South America driving the growth. And nuclear capacity stays relatively flat. And I'll say more about that because that's actually hiding a strong geographical shift. But the main sources of growth and the main growth stories are wind and solar PV. Solar PV capacity moves up through the ranks, becoming the 2nd largest source in terms of capacity behind only coal by 2040. This is the first time in our projections that this has been the case. And this is a direct result of both the policy support. We're now seeing over 140 countries worldwide supporting renewables and electricity, but also the growing competitiveness. And I'll say a bit more about that. So we also, to round out the overall technologies in power, we also have growth for other renewables. And that's bioenergy, geothermal power, and marine. And so overall, we're seeing that renewables make up 2/3 of total capacity additions globally. Now that means that regionally, we're also seeing this as that renewables are becoming the technology of choice everywhere. So for example, in the European Union, over 80% of new capacity coming online to 2040 in the new policy scenario will be renewables based. In China, it's 75%. In Korea, Central and South America, Japan, the US, India, it's all over 60% of new capacity coming online is renewables based. And in a number of these countries, solar PV is the largest, and in several cases, wind power is the largest source of new capacity. Only Southeast Asia and the Middle East have less than half of new capacity additions coming from renewables under current and proposed policies already. So that means investment climbs from about $300 billion today in renewables. So in 2017, $300 billion was invested in renewables. That moves beyond $350 billion in the next decade and up to $400 billion by 2040 for a total of $8 trillion to be invested in renewables in the coming years. That's 70% of overall power plant investment. Focus on nuclear for a moment. I mentioned there's a geographical shift happening. We have the longtime leaders of nuclear power, namely the United States, European Union, and Japan. And we're looking at the existing fleets are aging. The average age is about 40 years old, which happens also to be the standard lifetime, the design lifetime for those plants. So we're entering an era where the main question for advanced economies is what happens to the existing fleet? What will the role of nuclear be in the future? Depends on will those reactors, the lifetimes of those reactors be extended and for how long? So if in a case where the existing extensions are taken and we have no further projects beyond those that are already under construction, the role of nuclear would drop quite substantially down to just 5% of generation in these markets in most cases, a substantial decrease from where we are today. So there's a critical role here for what happens to those plants, because that would be a major challenge both for decarbonization and overall energy security. On the contrary, we have growth coming in several markets. The first among those is China, where in fact the nuclear capacity in China is set to overtake the United States by 2030 to become the global leader in the technology. China has built 70% of new capacity in the past 5 years, including 9 gigawatts already in 2018. And it accounts for another 1/4 of the capacity still under construction today. So this would take nuclear from a share of about 4% of generation in China today to about 11% in 2040, a major increase. But that's also accompanied by growth in Russia, India here, and several other countries, including in the Middle East, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, amongst them. So this is changing the regional balance, particularly for nuclear. So what does this mean for the generation mix? So capacity and generation are not the same thing. You have different operations amongst technologies. And so if we look at actually where we are today, in terms of the mix, 2/3 of electricity comes from fossil fuels, almost 40% of that from coal globally. Renewables account for close to 25% and clearly growing. If we look forward, as I mentioned, these capacity additions, we see a switching of positions between coal and renewables. In particular, you see that actually wind and solar approaches the level of coal going forward. By 2040, wind and solar account for over 20% of global generation. Overall, this means that the CO2, the carbon intensity of electricity supply falls dramatically, falls by more than 1/3 in the new policy scenario, falling below that of the intensity of a new combined cycle, very efficient gas-fired power plant by 2040. Hydro and nuclear power here are not to be forgotten, as very large additions in terms of low carbon generation, contributing about 25% or 1/4 of total global supply. So focusing in on the growth of wind and solar, which is really transforming electricity supply, as Laura mentioned, this is the key driver to look at in terms of the impacts on the overall power sector. And that brings us to the impact and the new key word we see coming for the power sector is flexibility. Flexibility has always been a part of power systems. We've always had demand changing from minute to minute, hour to hour, and supply generally changing to meet that. So what's changing in the future is we're also going to have variability coming from the supply side themselves. So wind and solar, which are dependent on the wind blowing and the sun shining, this variability makes the overall package a bit more challenging. So for example, in the coming decade, demand growth, flexibility is set to outpace demand growth by 4 times. We have a 20% increase in electricity demand globally and an 80% increase in the needs for flexibility in power systems. If we look at, we've mapped the shares of wind and solar PV generation and what this means for system integration. We've worked very hard with our colleagues from the System Integrations Unit on this, of identifying the phases of integration as you move up through the amounts of wind and solar in the system. So today in India, China, and the United States, you have less than 8% of annual generation from wind and solar PV. And that means you can accommodate this by mobilizing existing flexibility in systems. That doesn't mean there aren't challenges, but it requires that the flexibility in the system is sufficient. At higher phases of integration, we have the European Union and individual countries within it at much higher shares who are already looking into targeted investment in flexibility. Now that's anywhere from increasing regional cooperation through larger interconnections, demanding more flexibility from power plants themselves, but also looking to new sources of flexibility. And that will certainly be needed as we go towards 2030 and all regions move up in terms of phases, in terms of wind and solar PV generation. So we're seeing that in the US, China, and India move up closer to 20% of annual generation from wind and solar. European Union goes to 1/3, and some countries within it go towards 50% of annual generation coming from wind and solar. Now that means in some hours you have all of your demand met by wind and solar. That means in the following hours you may have a lot of variability required to be compensated by the rest of the system. And these changes also have implications across the economics of the entire systems as well as those individual technologies, and that's where we'll go next. So in terms of market designs, we wanted to highlight that the current market designs which have been developed, as Laura mentioned, the electricity sector is long established. These electricity designs, and particularly competitive market designs, have been developed for a number of years, looking over the past decades, and were largely based on the operations of fossil fuels. So as we're changing to wind and solar becoming dominant forms of generation, it's a stress test for the market designs themselves. So we've seen this already in recent years in the European Union, where particularly one place we looked was how much of your revenue for generators, how much of that comes from actually the sale of energy. We've seen since 2010, there's been a stark reduction, almost a 20% reduction, in how much of your total costs are covered from the energy-only markets themselves, dropping below 60% already in 2017. Now, supplementing that would be some capacity payments, some revenue earned in flexibility markets like ancillary service markets, and also those coming outside the market in the form of direct financial support. But this is already flagging a challenge on the way, and one that has often been expressed as a temporary situation. And that's a question we ask: is this temporary or is this more structural? Our analysis suggests that this is more structural. With wind and solar PV rising, we have downward pressure on revenues, and particularly we see that the challenge will be that energy markets themselves will provide less of the overall revenue package for entire companies and for individual power plants. Even if we add on top of that a rising CO2 price, which we assume in the new policy scenario going beyond $30 per ton by 2030, this only really maintains the current position and the current situation. Still, this is pressure on the existing system. This is potentially companies losing money, generators losing money, not able to cover their total costs. And this is something that overall, as consumers, we certainly all are affected by this. If these conditions, if electricity markets in total are not healthy, there's a challenge for investment to be timely and efficient. And certainly this question will remain, and there's pressure for market reforms in order to address this. And the last point I want to touch on, the last key point, is on competitiveness. So this is surely it's related to the past slide on market design and these sources of revenue. But what we're seeing for technologies is that these changes mean that we need to think more critically about how we measure competitiveness, what we think of competitiveness. For a long time, the levelized cost of electricity has been the basis and the key metric, or the most common metric for competitiveness. And that encompasses all of the cost metrics in one place, so all the cost components from the amount to invest, the fuel to operate them, the operation and maintenance along their lifetime, as well as any CO2 costs. And this gave a single, simple metric to compare across technologies. And we're seeing that this actually, in our analysis, does provide a good starting point, but we certainly need to go beyond that because it doesn't include anything on the value side or the revenue side. So if we think generally, and this is just a generic formulation here, but we put the value propositions for technologies in three buckets. We have the energy value provided to the system, so actually kilowatt hours, the capacity value provided to the system, so making sure you have electricity at all hours, and flexibility, making sure that you can accommodate these changes. So these three sources of value are critical to understanding and incorporating what determines a competitive technology. Now we call it system value here for a reason and not revenue. These may or may not exist in individual markets. And if they do, then this would be the revenue proposition and appropriate for investors. But in fact, they're still relevant everywhere. Policymakers need to consider these sources of value to the system and the overall competitiveness, because ultimately these are, whether or not they're priced in the market, these are covered and paid by consumers eventually. So to give a very quick view of how this actually applies, the new metric is called the value adjusted LCOE, or VALCO, where we combine the levelized costs and the value propositions for individual technologies. So every LCOE is different by technology, every value proposition is different by technology, and simulated based on our hourly models of electricity supply. So we take the example of China. What does this actually mean in practice? So for one, we still have these large drivers of change. We have the falling costs of solar PV. In particular, we've seen this dynamic change going on 2/3 in the last 5 years for the levelized cost. This is the dominant factor in the coming years. And we see the competitiveness of solar PV becoming very striking here. And I would suggest not to focus on the exact point they cross, but when these are in similar levels, because this is when it gets down to the regional detail and exact system that you're going into really start to matter. So these are already in very close proximity. And also we have solar PV with storage here that's coming down. What's more interesting then, when the value adjusted LCOE becomes more useful, is beyond that point, where we actually see that the value adjusted LCOE for solar PV start to go up. Here we have, even though the levelized costs of solar PV are still coming down, we see that it starts to erode, the amount of solar PV in the system starts to erode on the value of each additional unit. So the investment decision and the overall competitiveness picture is a little more complicated than just cost alone here. And that's where solar PV with storage, for example, can start to become more attractive. Now in China, these lines don't cross, but we know from analysis in others, in India, for example, solar PV with storage actually becomes more competitive than solar PV alone because of its value on flexibility and capacity. So in China, there are actually several other low carbon options that are similarly competitive, wind on shore, nuclear power. But in this band, you see that there are many options actually that are quite competitive across China. And that's generally good news in terms of addressing environmental concerns. What's a bit more challenging is that existing power plants, for example, existing coal power plants, remain quite attractive and difficult to displace based on the new costs alone. So previously those were for new projects. The dotted line there is for existing. And of course, beyond economics, there are reasons to develop new projects, to focus on new technologies. Offshore wind is also here, higher cost, but there are opportunities for cost reductions. There's opening up new technologies, and particularly this also might be for grid constraints. And as well, developing new gas-fired capacity in order to have very direct impacts on local air pollution concerns. And with that, I will hand it back. Please.
So we have heard from Stephanie a very bright future in terms of electricity demand growth. We have heard from Brent how new renewables are becoming ever more competitive, and this would actually point to a very bright picture for electricity. However, there are a few of our findings that point to reason of concern, and those were actually shared last week when we had the opportunity to present this work at our Energy Business Council that was bringing together over 50 companies that are very active in the electricity space throughout a bundle of different technologies and throughout the entire electricity system. And in fact, the key couple of words that came out during this meeting and that were really sparkling debate from our findings were policy headaches. Policy headaches ahead, and in some cases that were even bringing to migraines. Why those policy headaches? We have heard from Brent that our analysis very clearly shows that in Europe currently revenues from electricity only are insufficient to cover costs and would not give the necessary investments in new capacity. We are seeing this not only in Europe, but being also quite present in some parts of the United States. We have been seeing this in Australia, and we do think that this is not going to be only in those markets, but is a structural thing that we may be seeing elsewhere too. So on one hand, these designs of markets that are failing to actually maybe attracting new investment in capacity. On the other hand, flexibility becoming so crucial, and we are not really seeing policymakers catching up quickly enough to make sure that the value of flexibility is incorporated in market designs to make sure that the investment decisions are done in a timely manner to ensure that decarbonization and keeping the lights on are guaranteed everywhere. Now, one point for everyone to keep in mind is a good news. We find that 93% of electricity investment going forward will be government driven. This means that with the right regulation, we can actually bring the power sector in a very good trajectory that would be able to meet jointly climate and environmental targets, and at the same time ensuring the lights are on at all times. But we need to see changes very quickly in these market designs. Now, if we look at a final question that we ask ourselves, actually our executive director asked us to look at the X-ray of the energy infrastructure today. What is energy infrastructure? Is the buildings we're living in, is the power plants, is the airports, and so on. And what we find is first, one thing, it's clear that our new policy scenario doesn't lead to where we would like to be in terms of climate targets. Emissions should go down and go to net zero at a certain point in the future. Our new policy scenarios point to a continued increase. Emissions that are actually implied by existing infrastructure and those under construction have the profile that you are currently seeing on screen. Now, you may ask yourself, is it a lot? Is it little? Actually, this happens to be very, very close to a trajectory that would be needed to be if we want to comply with the Paris Agreement. This means that basically the current infrastructure is already eating up all the space that we have to be complying with the Paris Agreement. This means two things: that any strategy that wants to make sure that our energy sectors comply with our global climate target has to have two legs. One, looking into new infrastructure and making sure that there is a systematic preference vis-a-vis sustainable investments. And on the other hand, we look more and more at the existing infrastructure. For example, the building where we live will need to become a net zero energy building sometime soon in the future. We bring and we want to put a spotlight into one specific issue. Brent mentioned this earlier already: coal-fired power plants that are relatively young, half of the existing coal-fired power plants are very young teenagers, younger than 13 years old. They're going to be there with us for many years. In many cases, they are competitive. If we don't make sure that this create more space, meaning emit less than they would otherwise do, for example, with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, more efficient operations, and other technology innovations, it's going to be very difficult to be on track with our global climate targets. Very briefly, I will put up our key conclusions. The first one that we see overall for the world energy outlook is an increasing interlinkage between energy and geopolitics. This is very true for oil and gas, but the energy transition for the power sector also has implications for energy and geopolitics, using new materials such as cobalt, lithium, that are concentrated in a number of small countries that may actually bring up to the energy and geopolitics interlinkages new dimensions that were not there before. We certainly see electricity a huge opportunity going forward to decarbonize, to make our lives easier and better and more interconnected, but we have to bring an alarm bell to our governments, making sure that market designs actually catch up with the dramatic transformation that we're seeing in the sector and ensuring that investments are done in a timely manner. Don't take electrification equal decarbonization for granted. Without policies, that's not a given. New technologies are a must, and innovation is a must. And finally, we are saying this to all our governments and beyond, to our big IEA family. The future pathway really is open for the energy sector, and governments really hold the key, especially in the electricity sector, with 93% of the investment going forward really in their hands. I would like to take the opportunity to thank many of the attendees, as I see that many of them have been reviewing our work and working with us throughout the year. So many thanks to all of you for listening to us now. We have a few questions, and I would like to take them very quickly. If we manage, there are three. One is for Stephanie, and we've been asked if 100% electricity world is feasible. There is a second one actually on storage that I would like Claudia to take. What if storage would be much cheaper than we are expecting? Would this change your production? And the final one for Brent, something that we usually get, is are you revising your renewables projections again, and why so? If so, why so? Stephanie, is 100% electricity world feasible?
Sure. Thanks for this interesting question. So before doing this futurist electric scenario, we have started to assess what could be the technical potential of electricity demand within total final consumption. And we have found that around 65% of all final consumption could be electrified. It means that a third of the final consumption could not be electrified with the current technologies that are in place. We are talking mainly about shipping, aviation, but also other industrial processes where technologies are not readily available as of today. So that's why we don't see a more than 65% of share of electricity within total final consumption. Although this share is about electricity demand in final consumption, when we talk also about energy services or useful energy, this share could be even higher, given the high efficiency of electric technologies compared to their fossil fuel counterparts.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Claudia, do you want to let us know if we have assessed what would happen to our projections if storage would be cheaper than we are anticipating?
Good afternoon, everyone. So yes, this year we have incorporated many new technologies in our model and in our analysis. One of these is storage. In particular, we have assessed the competitiveness of battery storage, which we project will have cost reduced quite substantially in the next years to come. We have in our new policy scenario around 220 gigawatts of battery storage being installed by 2040, and we see competitiveness of battery being in standalone batteries, but also batteries being installed with the variable renewables such as solar PV and wind. This is something that we are seeing in markets already today, and we expect this to grow in the next years to come. In addition to this, we have also assessed what would be the impact of battery storage in the power system in the case of much more stronger cost reductions. Cost reductions in both the battery part of the storage system, but also in the non-battery packs, which is something that we are trying to look more in depth as well. And we have seen that with further cost reductions, we would have battery storage increasing to around 540 gigawatts by 2040, which is a really a great increase. And we are really looking this into in depth to see how the market and how the economics of the technology will evolve in the next years.
So very positive on already in our new policy scenario on the outlook for batteries, but it will go even stronger. Brent, your question on why did we revise upwards renewables and in particular solar this year and in the past couple of years?
Thanks very much for the question, and certainly it's a very important part of the projections. I mean, obviously the rise of solar PV here is quite critical, and the rise we've seen in the last few years, reaching a pinnacle in 2017, reaching a record level at the world level. But I think as soon as you need to dig just below the surface there to understand what's happening, and you quickly see that China has been a key driver and the leader in that growth in recent years. So in the past 5 years for solar PV, for example, 3/4 of the market growth came from China. China now accounts for half of the overall deployment annually. And so what happens in the decisions that are being made in Beijing has serious implications and direct implications for the solar PV market overall. So we continue to monitor those changes very closely. And that means we've seen in the past the changes are quite regular in policy, but we don't want to anticipate changes that aren't already there or aren't visible. So, I mean, for example, if you went back a decade in China, there was a goal for solar PV to be 1.8 gigawatts in 2020. They're going to be past 200 gigawatts with the changes in policy. So those policy revisions are directly then reflected in the new policy scenario and the main projections of the World Energy Outlook. So this isn't specific to just China. We've also seen changes in the European Union this year with an update to the Renewable Energy Directive for 2030, upgrading targets, revising upward those targets, and those are directly reflected in the work and our projections. It's also true for the United States, for example, and all around the world. So we're monitoring policy changes around the world, which are the key driver for renewables to date. And this point I talked about on competitiveness is a view to, in the long term, how much the falling costs will play a role, which we know is a part of this positive feedback loop between policy support and the cost reductions seen in the market. And the second point I would want to make is that while we have seen great strides for solar PV and we've revised upwards the projections there, it's not necessarily the case for overall renewables. So renewables in electricity, we're seeing beyond 40% of generation in 2040. That's a fairly similar number from several years ago. Unfortunately, has actually remained quite similar over the years because there's been a shifting of emphasis from one technology to another. We've actually seen the capacity additions of wind go down in recent years while solar PV is rising. So in effect, we need to push and support all low carbon technologies in order to achieve the overall environmental goals, not just solar PV, not just wind, not just any of these technologies. Thank you.
So our new policy scenario is indeed reflecting year-on-year policy changes the governments around the world are introducing in renewables. This has been certainly the more active area that governments have been put their attention on, and we hope that our analysis pointing to our governments the gap between where we would need to be in the sustainable development scenario and where we are heading in the new policy scenario has actually been source of inspiration for them to actually increase their support for renewables and notably solar China is certainly be one of the key highlights with multiplying by over 100 their set policy for solar in just less than a decade. I would like to conclude this webinar here. Thank very much both Brent Warner and Stephanie Bouquet and all the colleagues that will be sitting here with us today, not only for the webinar, but for the great work over the year and have been leading and working on this fantastic in-depth on electricity. And many thanks to all of you for having followed us and to all the many reviewers and contributors that are still listening. Thanks a lot for all your cooperation throughout the year. Thank you.